If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The mansion stood imposing in the heart of Belgravia, one of London's most exclusive neighbourhoods. Seen from the outside, it was an architectural dream of modern lines, smoked glass, and impeccably manicured gardens. But anyone who crossed the electronic gate and entered that private universe would quickly discover that something inside defied the logic of luxury and ostentation. There was no light, or rather, there was only the bare minimum necessary for the adults to move around without. Dripping. Heavy, dark velvet curtains completely blocked the entry of sunlight. LED fixtures emitted only a weak, yellowish glow, as if the entire house were immersed in a permanent twilight. The silence was another disturbing element. There were no children's laughs, no music, no the typical noise of a living home. Everything there seemed suspended in time, as if life itself had been placed on a solemn and unbreakable pause. Julia Evans took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell for the first time. At 32, her brown eyes carried a mixture of determination and exhaustion. She had worked for nearly 8 years as an occupational therapy assistant at an institution specializing in children with low vision and visual impairments. She loved that job. She loved seeing each child's progress, celebrating small achievements, teaching adapted games, and witnessing genuine smiles. But the institution had closed its doors 6 months ago due to a lack of funding, and since then, Julia had been facing a harsh reality: unemployment, accumulating bills, and the urgent need to accept any opportunity that arose. When she saw the ad for a caregiver in a high-end residence, she didn't hesitate. It wasn't exactly what she had dreamed of doing with her experience, but it was a fresh start, and she desperately needed one. The door was opened by a middle-aged woman, dressed in an immaculate white coat and a serious expression that did not invite a smile. She introduced herself as Marissa, the coordinating nurse of the home's care team. Her tone was formal, almost robotic. Julia was led through wide, gloomy corridors. Her boots made a muffled sound on the dark marble floor. Paintings on the walls were just undefined silhouettes in the semi-darkness. The temperature was pleasant, but the air seemed heavy with something invisible and oppressive. It was like being inside a museum after closing hours, where everything is preserved, but nothing truly lives. Marissa spoke as they walked. The rules were many. Julia was to keep the curtains always closed, never turn on bright lights, never question the medical protocols, never suggest changes to the routine without the approval of Dr. Marshall Taylor, the physician responsible for the boys. She was to accompany the children in predetermined activities, supervise meals, ensure hygiene, and above all strictly follow the established schedules. No improvisations, no unauthorized stimuli, no inconvenient questions. Julia just nodded, but inside a voice began to scream. This made no sense. In her experience with visually impaired children, the golden rule had always been the opposite: stimulate, explore, offer sensory variety, encourage autonomy. Why so much control? Why so much rigidity? They finally reached the twins' room. Marissa knocked lightly on the door before opening it. The room was spacious, decorated with custom-built furniture and a multitude of toys organized on shelves. But everything was enveloped in the same suffocating gloom, and there, sitting side by side in an armchair, too large for their small bodies, were Lucas and Gabriel. Julia felt her heart ache. The boys were 8 years old, with neatly cut brown hair, impeccable clothes, and a strangely formal posture for children their age. They were motionless, with their hands in their laps and their faces turned forward, but not focusing on anything specific. Their eyes were dark and expressive, but they were empty of curiosity. They looked like two little soldiers awaiting orders. Marissa made the introductions briefly and left, leaving Julia alone with the boys for the first time. She knelt in front of them, maintaining a respectful distance, and said softly, "Hi, Lucas. Hi, Gabriel. My name is Julia. I've come to keep you company, help with your activities, and who knows, maybe we can have some fun together. Is that okay?" The boys didn't answer immediately. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Then Gabriel, the one on the right, tilted his head slightly and murmured, "Good morning, ma'am." Lucas repeated the same phrase in the same monotone voice. There was no emotion, no spontaneity. It was as if they were following a memorized script. Julia forced a smile, though she knew they supposedly couldn't see it. But something inside her insisted on maintaining natural gestures. She started talking, asking simple questions about what they liked to do, what their favorite toys were, if they used to listen to stories. The answers were short, polite, and completely devoid of enthusiasm. It was like talking to two miniature adults, conditioned to answer only what was necessary. During that first hour, Julia observed everything carefully. She observed how the boys moved around the room with almost mathematical precision. She observed how Gabriel turned his face exactly in the direction of the door when Marissa passed by in the hallway outside, before any sound of footsteps was audible. She observed how Lucas, when picking up a glass of juice from the side table, positioned his hand with a certainty that required no fumbling. She observed the way they both avoided obstacles with subtle head movements, as if they were mapping the space without needing to touch. Children blind from birth, diagnosed with total irreversible blindness, did not act like this. Julia knew this. She had spent years with dozens of children with varying degrees of visual impairment. She knew the patterns, the behaviors, the natural adaptations, and what she saw there did not match the diagnosis she had been given. In the middle of the morning, Robert Forrester entered the room. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and graying hair at the temples. He wore an impeccable suit, but his eyes carried a weight that no expensive fabric could hide. He was the boys' father, a widower since the twins were just 6 months old. His wife, Helen, had passed away under circumstances that no one in the house mentioned openly. Since then, Robert had become a shadow of his former self. A successful businessman in the tech industry, he managed multi-million-dollar businesses competently, but had completely lost the ability to manage his own happiness. He greeted Julia politely but distantly. He asked a few questions about her previous experience, about how she was adapting to the house's routine. Julia answered professionally, but took the opportunity to make a suggestion. "Mr. Forrester, I've noticed the house is very dark. I know the boy's diagnosis is delicate, but in my experience, even children with blindness can benefit from natural light to regulate their biological rhythm, improve their mood, and stimulate other senses. Would it be possible to open the curtains a little at some point during the day?" Robert tensed. His jaw tightened and he looked away. Before he could answer, the deep, authoritative voice of Dr. Marshall Taylor cut through the air. "That is absolutely out of the question." Julia turned and saw a man of about 50, impeccably dressed, with an expression that mixed arrogance and false cordiality. He approached with calculated steps and continued. "Miss Evans, I understand you have prior experience, but the boy's case is extremely specific. Exposure to light can cause severe neurological crises, intense pain, and irreparable setbacks. Every protocol here has been carefully developed based on years of studies and monitoring. Any deviation could put their health at risk. I hope that is clear." Julia swallowed her frustration. It wasn't the time to confront. She was new there. But something in the way the doctor spoke, in the way he dominated the conversation and silenced any questioning, set off an internal alarm. "Of course, doctor. I just wanted to understand better," she replied, keeping her voice calm. Marshall smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He turned to Robert and exchanged a few words in a low voice before leaving. Robert remained there for a few more minutes, watching his sons in silence. There was love in that gaze, but also resignation and guilt. He was a man who believed he had failed his own children, and now clung to the only certainties he had, the diagnoses and the exorbitant treatments that consumed his fortune. When Robert finally left, Julia turned her attention back to the boys. They remained seated, quiet, as if none of it affected them. But Julia noticed something different. Gabriel had a single tear silently streaming down his face. Just one. He made no sound. He didn't wipe it away. He just let the tear fall. Julia approached slowly and gently touched the boy's shoulder. "Gabriel, are you okay? Did something happen?" The boy hesitated. Then, in an almost inaudible voice, he murmured, "You're not going to leave, are you?" Julia felt a lump in her throat. That question carried a deep fear, a loneliness no child should feel. She held Gabriel's small hand and answered firmly. "No, Gabriel, I'm not going to leave. I'm here, and I'm going to take care of you." Lucas, who had remained silent until then, also reached out and touched Julia's arm. It was a simple gesture, but one laden with meaning. These boys lived in a prison of silence and control, and for the first time in a long time, someone had offered them something different, something that felt like affection. The rest of the day followed the rigid routine. Julia accompanied the boys in physical therapy sessions, scheduled meals and motor coordination activities supervised by other professionals on the team. They were all competent but distant. No one played, no one laughed, no one treated Lucas and Gabriel like children. At the end of the afternoon, Julia was dismissed. Before leaving, she passed through the kitchen and found Mr. Armstrong, the family's driver and caretaker, a man in his late 50s who had worked for the family for over a decade. He was making coffee and offered Julia a cup. She accepted gratefully. "So, how was the first day?" asked Mr. Armstrong with a kind smile. "Different," Julia replied, choosing her words carefully. "The house is very beautiful, but it has a strange atmosphere. The boys are very quiet." Mr. Armstrong sighed and lowered his voice. "It's always been like this since they were born. The boss suffers so much he's put all his hope in the treatments, spent more money than I can imagine. But nothing changes. The boys remain in the dark. It's heartbreaking." Julia took a sip of coffee and pondered what to say. "And the doctor, Dr. Marshall?" Mr. Armstrong hesitated. Julia noticed he was choosing his words even more carefully. "He's been the family doctor for many years. He was the one who diagnosed the boys when they were babies. The boss trusts him completely. Some of the other staff who've worked here, well, some had doubts, but nobody stays long. They either leave on their own or they're let go." "Why do they leave?" Julia insisted. Mr. Armstrong looked around, making sure they were alone. "Because they ask too many questions. Because they try to change things. And Dr. Marshall doesn't like that. He has a lot of influence over the boss. Look, I'm not saying anything wrong, I'm just warning you. If you want to stay here, follow the rules. Don't question. Don't get too involved." Julia thanked him for the coffee and the conversation, but left with an even heavier heart. On the way back to her small apartment in East London, she couldn't stop thinking about the boys, about Gabriel's silent tears, about Lucas's timid gesture, about the way they both reacted to their environment in ways that made no sense for blind children. That night, Julia barely slept. She replayed every detail, every behavior, every reaction of the twins in her mind. She thought of all the children she had worked with over the years. She thought of the stimulation protocols, the visual perception tests, the adaptation exercises. And the more she thought, the more certain she became something was deeply wrong in that house. On the second day, Julia arrived at the mansion determined to observe even more closely. She was greeted again by Marissa, who handed her a list of the day's activities and reinforced the same instructions. Julia just nodded and went to the boys' room. Lucas and Gabriel were sitting in the same armchair, in the same position as the day before. But when Julia entered, they both turned their faces slightly in her direction. She hadn't made a sound yet, hadn't said good morning, had just pushed the door open silently. How did they know she was there? "Good morning, boys," Julia said, observing their reactions. "Good morning, Julia," they replied almost in unison, and for the first time there was a different tone, a slight animation, an expectation. Julia smiled. "Today we're going to do some different activities. How about we play a little?" The boys exchanged quick glances. Glances. Julia caught that. Blind children don't exchange glances. They might turn their heads toward each other, but there's no visual exchange. That was a look of complicity. Quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Julia sat on the floor and began to tell a story. She used different voices, made sounds with her mouth, clapped her hands, in various rhythms. The boys reacted. They smiled. Gabriel even laughed softly at a funny part. They were genuine reactions, reactions of children who finally felt at ease. In the middle of the morning, Julia decided to conduct a discreet test. While arranging some toys on a shelf, She purposely dropped a small red toy car on the floor, far from where the boys were. The car rolled silently across the carpet and stopped about 2 meters away. Julia pretended not to have seen it and continued organizing the shelf. A few seconds later, Lucas stood up and walked directly to the car. He didn't grope, he didn't hesitate. He went straight to it. He picked up the car and put it back on the correct shelf. Then he returned to the armchair as if nothing had happened. Julia felt her heart race. That wasn't possible. A child with total blindness would never locate a small, silent, distant object without exploring the space by sound or touch. Lucas had acted as if he had seen the car. She needed more evidence, but she had to be careful. If she asked direct questions, she might scare the boys or attract the attention of the professionals circulating through the house. During lunch, Julia observed another revealing scene. Gabriel spilled juice on the table. The spot was small, the size of a coin, and was about 30 centimeters from his hand. Without fumbling, without exploring, Gabriel placed his hand exactly on the spot and asked for a napkin. Julia handed him the napkin and watched as he wiped it up with precision. "How did you know where the juice was?" Julia asked, keeping her tone casual. Gabriel tensed up. He hesitated. Then he replied, "I smelled it." Julia didn't press, but she knew. That answer didn't make sense. The orange juice didn't have a strong enough scent to be located so precisely from that distance. Gabriel was lying, or rather, he was hiding something. In the mid-afternoon, while the boys were resting, Julia seized a moment when Marissa was busy and discreetly entered Robert's office. The door was ajar, and she knew she was taking a huge risk, but the need to understand what was happening was stronger. The room was elegant, with mahogany shelves full of books and a large desk covered in papers. Julia glanced around quickly and saw a thick folder with Lucas and Gabriel, medical history written on the spine. She took the folder and began to flip through it. The first documents were reports from when the boys were babies. In them, an ophthalmologist named Dr. Helen Martin described detailed examinations. Presence of pupillary response to light, possible residual vision, continuous monitoring, and early visual stimulation recommended. Julia kept flipping. The following reports, all signed by Dr. Marshall Taylor, were completely different. Total irreversible blindness, absence of response to any light stimulus, prognosis with no possibility of recovery. How was it possible that two professionals reached such opposite conclusions about the same patients? Julia quickly photographed some documents with her phone and put the folder back in its place. Her heart was pounding. She was starting to piece together a disturbing puzzle. That evening, before leaving, Julia waited for the boys to fall asleep and went to their room. The house was silent. She discreetly opened a small crack in the curtain, just enough for a beam of light from the street lamp to enter the room. Then she watched. Lucas and Gabriel were in their beds, supposedly asleep. But when the light came in, they both blinked. They brought their hands to their eyes. They turned their faces toward the window. Automatic reactions, visual reflexes. Julia quickly closed the curtain and left the room. She was sure now. Those children were not blind, or at least not completely blind, and someone, for some reason, was hiding it. Someone was keeping Lucas and Gabriel trapped in an artificial darkness, in a lie that had lasted for 8 years. She needed to find out why. She needed to find out who. And above all, she needed to save those children before it was too late. The following days turned into a delicate dance between following the house rules and discreetly searching for the truth. Julia arrived every morning with a heavy heart, knowing that each moment with Lucas and Gabriel was an opportunity to discover more about what was really happening in that silent mansion. And with each passing day, the evidence piled up like pieces of a puzzle that began to reveal a disturbing picture. On the Monday of the second week, Julia decided to conduct more systematic tests. She waited for a moment when Marissa was busy with phone calls and the other professionals were on their breaks. Then she discreetly locked the door to the boys' room and took out some materials she had prepared at home over the weekend. They were simple objects, cardstock cards with high-contrast geometric shapes, a small phone flashlight with adjustable intensity, and some colorful toys. She sat on the floor with the twins and said in a low voice, almost as if sharing a secret, "Boys, I need to do some exercises with you. They're different from the ones you do with the other professionals, but it's important that we do them together, okay? And it's important that it's just between the three of us. Can you keep a secret?" Lucas and Gabriel exchanged that quick glance again. Julia was sure now that they communicated visually. Gabriel bit his lower lip and asked, "Are we going to get in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. No one will get in trouble. I just want to understand better how you perceive things around you. Do you trust me?" The boys hesitated, but then Lucas nodded. "We trust you." Julia started with the most basic test. She held the phone flashlight on its weakest setting, about a meter away from the boys. She turned it on and off slowly. "Do you notice any difference now?" "It got brighter," Gabriel replied almost immediately, before realizing what he had said. He clapped a hand over his mouth, frightened. Julia kept her voice calm. "It's okay, Gabriel. You don't have to be afraid. You're right, it did get brighter. And that's a good thing, a very good thing." She continued with the tests, gradually increasing the complexity. She showed cards with black circles on a white background. Lucas was able to identify the shape. She showed cards with red squares. Gabriel said it looked different from the first one, but couldn't name the color precisely. Julia then used three-dimensional objects, moving them slowly from side to side. Both boys followed the movements with their eyes, albeit discreetly and hesitantly. It was undeniable. Lucas and Gabriel had vision. It might not have been perfect or complete vision, but there was visual capability there, the ability to distinguish light from dark, shapes, movements, and possibly even high-contrast colors. This was not compatible with the diagnosis of total irreversible blindness that was in all the medical reports signed by Dr. Marshall Taylor. After the tests, Julia put the materials away. Tan sat on the floor next to the boys. "Now it was time to talk. I need you to tell me something. How long have you been able to perceive light and shapes?" The twins tensed up. Gabriel started to cry softly. "We can't talk about it. Dr. Marshall said we can't." Julia felt anger rising within her, but she kept her voice gentle. "Why can't you talk about it, Gabriel?" It was Lucas who answered, with a frightening maturity for an 8-year-old. "Because Dad will be sad. The doctor said Dad spent a lot of money trying to cure us, and that if we tell him we can see something, Dad will think he failed, that he's a bad father. And we don't want Dad to be sad. He already suffers so much." Julia felt tears well up in her own eyes. These children were living a lie to protect their father. But who had put them in this position? Who had planted this terrible idea in their heads? "And have you always seen something? Since you were little?" Gabriel wiped his tears with the back of his hand. "We don't really remember, but we always knew when it was light or when it was dark, and we could always see the shapes of big things like doors and windows. But Dr. Marshall said that's not important, that it's not really seeing, that we have to be quiet and obey." Julia hugged both boys tightly. Her heart was broken. "You haven't done anything wrong, and seeing, even if it's just a little bit, is very important. Very important indeed. And I promise you, we will sort this out. But for now, you need to keep acting like you always do when the other adults are around, okay? It's important that no one suspects anything yet. Can you do that for me?" The boys agreed. And for the first time since Julia had arrived at that house, she saw hope in their eyes. A fragile but real hope. That afternoon, Julia left the mansion with a clear mission. She needed to find Dr. Helen Martin, the ophthalmologist who had examined the boys as babies and whose reports pointed to a completely different diagnosis than what was later established. The documents Julia had photographed contained the name of the clinic where the doctor used to work years ago, but there was no guarantee she would still be there. Julia took 3 buses to reach South London, where St. Lucy's Eye Clinic was located. It was a modest, well-kept building with a welcoming reception and walls decorated with educational posters about eye health. The receptionist, a young woman with curly hair, looked up from her computer as Julia approached. "Good afternoon. I'd like to speak with Dr. Helen Martin. Does she still practice here?" The receptionist hesitated. Dr. Martin no longer practices at this clinic. She moved a few years ago. Julia felt a wave of disappointment but persisted. Do you have any way to contact her? It's about a very important case she followed years ago. The young woman looked around as if to make sure no one was listening, and then jotted down a phone number on a piece of paper. She has a private practice now. It's on Harley Street, but I don't know if she'll see you without a prior appointment. She's very strict with her schedule. Julia thanked her and left with the paper tucked away like a treasure. On the way back home, she called the number. A mature, firm female voice answered on the other end. Dr. Helen Martin's office. Julia took a deep breath. Good afternoon, my name is Julia Evans. I work as a caregiver for the twins, Lucas and Gabriel Forrester. You examined them when they were babies, and I urgently need to speak with you about their case. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the voice returned, but now with a different tone, laden with something that seemed to be a mix of surprise and concern. The Forrester twins. I remember them. I remember them very well. Can you come to my office tomorrow, at 8 in the evening, after hours? I think we need to talk away from prying eyes. Julia agreed and hung up, her heart racing. There was something in that conversation that confirmed her suspicions. Dr. Martin knew something, and she was willing to share it. The next day, Julia went through her routine at the mansion, trying to act normal, but she could feel the atmosphere in the house was changing. Marissa was watching her more closely. The other professionals were asking questions about the activities she did with the boys, and Dr. Marshall Taylor, who used to show up only 2 or 3 times a week, was now present every day, pacing the corridors with that expression of false cordiality that hid something much darker. During lunch, Marshall sat down at the staff table where Julia was eating alone. He brought a cup of coffee and leaned his elbows on the table, studying her with penetrating eyes. Julia, I've noticed you've become quite involved with the boys. They seem more animated lately. Julia kept her voice calm. I try to create a welcoming environment. I think they miss affection. They're children, after all. Marshall smiled, but it was a calculated smile. No doubt. But it's important to remember that affection cannot override medical protocols. These boys are fragile. Any inappropriate stimulation could cause irreversible damage. I hope you're not doing anything that could compromise their treatment. Julia looked him in the eye. I follow all the instructions I was given, Doctor. Excellent, because if I find out that someone is putting my patient's health at risk, I will be forced to take measures, serious measures. You understand, don't you? It was a veiled threat. Julia knew it, but she couldn't back down now. I understand perfectly, Doctor. Marshall finished his coffee, stood up, and left the break room without another word. Julia remained there, trembling slightly. She was dealing with something much bigger and more dangerous than she had initially imagined. That night, Julia arrived at Dr. Helen Martin's office promptly at 8 o'clock. The practice was in a discreet commercial building with a small plaque on the door indicating the specialty. Helen greeted her personally. She was a woman of about 55, with grey hair tied in an elegant bun, and blue eyes that conveyed intelligence and accumulated weariness. Come in, Julia. We can talk right here. The building is empty at this hour. They sat in comfortable armchairs in the waiting room. Helen served tea and remained silent for a few seconds, as if organizing her thoughts. Then she began to speak. I remember the Forrester twins as if I had examined them yesterday. They were beautiful babies, only 6 months old when they first came to my practice. The father was devastated. His wife had recently passed away, and he was alone, trying to understand what was happening with his sons. I performed all the necessary exams, ophthalmoscopy, pupillary reflex tests, retinal analysis, and what I found was not total blindness. There was a condition called optic nerve hyperplasia, which can cause low vision, but the babies had a response to light. They had the potential to develop functional vision with proper stimulation and continuous monitoring. And what happened? Why did the diagnosis change? Helen sighed deeply. I presented my findings to the father and recommended a follow-up plan. But before I could proceed, he told me he had consulted another specialist, Dr. Marshall Taylor. who was a family friend and had an impeccable reputation. Marshall re-evaluated the boys and came to a completely opposite conclusion. According to him, the babies had total irreversible blindness, and any attempt at visual stimulation would be not only useless but harmful. He convinced the father that my exams were mistaken and that I lacked the experience to handle such a severe case. Julia felt indignation rising. "But you didn't question it. You didn't try to show him the exams?" "I tried. I contacted the father several times. I sent the detailed reports, but Marshall had already planted the seed of doubt, and he was very convincing. Moreover, he offered an expensive, exclusive treatment that promised to at least alleviate symptoms and provide comfort. The father, desperate and guilt-ridden, accepted. I was basically excluded from the case." "And isn't that unethical? Couldn't you report him?" Helen lowered her eyes. "Julia, you don't understand how the system works. Marshall Taylor isn't just a doctor. He's extremely well connected. He's on boards, has influence in top hospitals, publishes articles. If I reported him without absolute proof, it would be my word against his, and he would have destroyed my career. I tried to be cautious, I investigated discreetly, and I discovered that the twins were not the only case." Julia leaned forward. "What did you discover?" Helen picked up a folder from the coffee table and opened it. Inside were copies of reports, notes, and even newspaper clippings. "Over the last 15 years, I've identified at least 12 similar cases. Wealthy families, children with diagnoses of severe and irreversible conditions, exorbitantly expensive treatments that lasted for years with no real results. In every case, Marshall Taylor was involved, and in every case, clinics, labs, and therapists linked to him profited in the millions." "It's a scheme," Julia murmured, her stomach churning. "It's more than that. It's a network. Marshall doesn't work alone. He has partners, shell companies, contracts that ensure families keep paying indefinitely. And the worst part is that the children are the biggest victims. They grow up believing they are incapable, dependent, without a future, when in fact, many of them have the potential for recovery." Julia felt tears in her eyes. "The boys told me that Marshall instructed them to hide any sign of vision. They're living this lie so as not to disappoint their father." Helen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "That's monstrous, but it's exactly the kind of manipulation he uses. He turns the children into unwilling accomplices in their own imprisonment." "What can I do? How can I help them?" Helen looked at Julia with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're dealing with something very dangerous, Julia. Marshall won't let you expose this easily. He has lawyers, influence, money. He can destroy your reputation, invent accusations, make you lose everything." Julia stood up, determined. "I don't care. Those children need help, and I'm not going to abandon them." Helen took a business card and handed it to Julia. "If you're really going to face this, you'll need allies. This is the contact for a lawyer who specializes in the rights of people with disabilities. She has experience with medical fraud cases. And this other contact is for an investigative journalist who tried to expose Marshall in the past but couldn't get enough proof. If you have solid evidence, they can help." Julia took the cards as if they were gold. "And you? Will you support me if I need a witness?" Helen hesitated, then nodded. "I will. I should have done this years ago. I won't make the same mistake again." The two women parted with a hug. Julia left with the certainty that she had found a powerful ally. But she also knew that the battle was just beginning. In the following days, Julia intensified her tests with Lucas and Gabriel whenever she had the chance. She began to document everything. She discreetly photographed the boys' reactions to light, recorded short videos showing how they identified colored objects, and kept a diary of every behavior that contradicted the diagnosis of total blindness. It was proof, concrete proof that could be used at the right time. But keeping the secret was becoming increasingly difficult. The twins were changing. They were becoming more cheerful, more communicative, asking questions about the outside world they had never asked before. And that was drawing attention. Marissa started asking questions. Why were the boys so different? What was Julia doing with them? Why were they smiling so much now? Julia made up excuses. She said she was just working on the emotional side, offering more affection, building bonds, but she knew that time was running out. Marshall could sense that something was out of his control, and men like him didn't let things get out of control for long. On the Friday of that week, Robert asked to speak with Julia in his office. She entered with her heart pounding, not knowing what to expect. The businessman was sitting behind the large mahogany desk, his hands clasped and a tired expression on his face. "Julia, I need to thank you. I don't know what you're doing, but my sons are different. They're more alive, happier. I haven't seen this in years." Julia seized the opportunity. "Mr. Forrester, may I ask you a question? When was the last time you saw Lucas and Gabriel in the sun, playing outdoors, running in a garden?" Robert looked confused. "They can't do that. The light causes them pain. Dr. Marshall has always been very clear about that. But have you ever seen it happen? Have you ever seen them in pain from the light?" Robert hesitated. "Not directly, but the medical reports are clear. And I trust Dr. Marshall. He's been taking care of my sons since they were born." Julia knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but she couldn't back down now. "Mr. Forrester, what if there's another possibility? What if the boys aren't as fragile as we've been told? Wouldn't you want to be absolutely sure?" Robert looked at her with an expression that mixed hope and fear. "What are you talking about, Julia?" Julia took a deep breath. "I'm talking about getting a second opinion, about allowing another specialist to examine the boys. No pressure, no commitment, just to be sure we're doing the best for them." Robert was silent for a long time. Then, his voice choked with emotion, he said, "I'm scared, Julia. I'm scared of having hope and finding out there's nothing that can be done. I'm scared of failing my sons again." Julia approached and gently touched his arm. "You haven't failed. You've always fought for them. But maybe now it's time to fight in a different way. Let me show you something." She took out her phone and showed Robert some of the discreet videos she had recorded. Lucas following a flashlight with his eyes, Gabriel identifying colored shapes, both of them reacting to natural light in a positive and curious way. Robert watched it all in silence, tears streaming down his face. When the videos ended, he looked at Julia and said with a broken voice, "What have I done to my sons? What have I allowed to be done to them? You trusted who you thought was right. That's not your fault. But now you know the truth, and you can do something about it." Robert wiped his tears, and his expression changed. Vulnerability gave way to determination. "I want a meeting with Dr. Marshall tomorrow, and I want you to be there." Julia agreed. The battle was about to begin. Saturday dawned with a grey sky over London. Heavy clouds covered the city, as if the weather itself was anticipating the storm about to break inside the Forrester mansion. Julia arrived earlier than usual, her stomach churning with anxiety. She knew this day would be decisive. Either she would succeed in proving that the boys had been victims of a monstrous fraud, or she would lose everything and leave Lucas and Gabriel even more vulnerable. Robert had been in his office since 6 in the morning. He had spent a sleepless night reviewing documents, rereading medical reports and confronting numbers. How much money had he spent over those 8 years? How much had he invested in treatments, therapies, equipment, and consultations that he now realized might never have been necessary? The figures were astronomical. Millions of pounds. A fortune. That could have changed the lives of hundreds of families, but had been funneled into a scheme that kept his own sons trapped in an artificial darkness. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Marshall Taylor arrived punctually, as always. He wore an impeccable grey suit, carried a leather briefcase, and wore that unshakable expression of confidence he had cultivated over decades. He greeted Robert with a firm handshake and glanced quickly at Julia, who was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room. His gaze was cold, calculating. He already knew something was different. "Robert, good to see you. I received your request for a meeting and came immediately. I hope there's no problem with the boys." Robert gestured for Marshall to sit. His voice was different. It no longer had the tone of reverence he used to use when speaking to the doctor. "Dr. Marshall, I would like us to re-evaluate my son's diagnosis." Marshall blinked, surprised. "Re-evaluate? Robert, we've done that countless times over the years." The diagnosis is clear. Total irreversible blindness. I understand it's difficult to accept, but medicine has its limits. Robert opened a folder on the desk and pushed some documents toward the doctor. These are the reports from Dr. Helen Martin from when the boys were babies. She identified significant residual vision and recommended early visual stimulation. Why are your reports completely opposite? Marshall picked up the documents and leafed through them quickly, showing no signs of nervousness. Helen Martin is a competent professional, but she lacked experience with cases as complex as your son's. The initial exams may have shown residual reflexes, but later studies confirmed there was no real visual function. I re-evaluated the boys constantly, and the results were always the same. Julia couldn't contain herself. And why were the boys never exposed to natural light? Why do they live locked in darkness if they themselves react positively to luminosity? Marshall turned to her with a look of barely concealed contempt. Miss Evans, with all due respect, you are not a doctor. You are not qualified to question clinical protocols. Exposure to light could cause irreversible neurological damage in these children. Julia stood up, took out her phone, and started playing the videos she had recorded. She showed Lucas following light movements with his eyes. She showed Gabriel identifying colored shapes. She showed both boys reacting positively and curiously to controlled natural light. So, is this neurological damage, Doctor? Because to me it looks like children seeing. The silence in the room was deafening. Marshall watched the videos with an expression that started as controlled, but slowly transformed into something darker. When the videos ended, he stood up abruptly, his face red with contained anger. This is a grave interference in the treatment of these children. You have exposed vulnerable patients to unauthorized stimuli. This could have caused damage that will take months to reverse. Robert, I demand that this woman be removed immediately. She is putting your son's health at risk. Robert also stood up, facing Marshall for the first time in 8 years as an equal, not as a desperate subordinate. I saw the videos, Marshall. I saw my sons reacting positively to light. I saw them identifying colors and shapes. That's not possible if they are completely blind. Unless you've been hiding something from me all these years. Marshall pointed a finger at Robert, his voice filled with indignation. I have dedicated nearly a decade of my career to caring for your sons. I developed exclusive protocols. I brought in specialists from other countries. I invested my time, my reputation. And now you question my work because of some manipulated videos from an unqualified employee. Julia stepped forward. Manipulated? Are you saying I edited the children's reactions, that I invented their ability to follow light with their eyes? Marshall ignored her and turned back to Robert. I'm going to be very clear. Either you give me total authority over the boys' treatment again, or I will withdraw from the case, and I assure you that no other reputable specialist will agree to take on patients who have been subjected to this kind of irresponsible interference. It was a direct threat. Marshall was betting that Robert, out of fear and insecurity, would back down, but he didn't know the man standing before him now. The Robert who had spent the night reviewing documents, confronting numbers, and finally allowing himself to question truths he had blindly accepted for so long. Robert took a deep breath and said firmly, "Then I accept your withdrawal from the case, Dr. Marshall, and I will seek a second opinion. In fact, several opinions. From professionals who have no financial ties to the clinics and labs you've recommended over the years." Marshall turned pale. His eyes narrowed and he took a threatening step toward Robert. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're going to ruin your sons' lives because of false hopes planted by an opportunist." Julia moved forward, placing herself between the two men. "Opportunist? I've gained nothing from this. I just want these children to have a chance to live for real, to see the world, to be happy. You're the one who has profited millions by keeping them in the dark." Marshall laughed sarcastically. "You think you can prove that? You think you can accuse me without consequences? I have an impeccable reputation. I've published dozens of articles. I sit on the most important boards in the field. One word from me, and your career is over before it even begins." Julia didn't back down. "Then do it. But before that, I'll make sure that every family you've deceived knows the truth." The tension in the room was at its peak when the office door opened. Marissa rushed in, a worried expression on her face. "Mr. Forrester, sorry to interrupt, but it's about Gabriel. He's having a seizure." They all ran to the boys' room. Gabriel was lying on the bed, his hands pressing against his temples and moaning softly in pain. Lucas was beside him, holding his brother's hand and crying. Marshall immediately took control of the situation, pushing Julia aside and beginning to examine the boy with quick, precise movements. "He's having a neurological seizure, exactly what I warned could happen with improper exposure to light. We need to sedate him immediately." Robert was pale, torn between trusting the videos he had seen and the fear of making a mistake that could cost his son's health. Julia, however, watched the scene carefully. Something was wrong. Gabriel wasn't really in pain. His eyes weren't squeezed shut. His breathing wasn't rapid. He was putting on an act. Julia knelt by the bed and said in a low voice, just for Gabriel to hear, "Are you okay, sweetheart? Really?" Gabriel opened his eyes slightly and looked at Julia. It was a quick glance, but it said everything. He was faking it, and he was doing it because Marshall had instructed him to. It was the perfect trap. Create a fake crisis to justify Julia's dismissal and regain total control over the family. Julia stood up and faced Marshall. "He's not having a seizure. He's faking it because you told him to." Marshall glared at her. "That is an absurd and irresponsible accusation. You're delusional." Julia ignored the doctor and turned to Robert. "Mr. Forrester, do you trust me?" Robert looked at his sons, at Marshall, at Julia. He was in the middle of a war he didn't know how to fight, but then he saw something that made him decide. He saw Lucas looking directly at him. It wasn't the vacant gaze of a blind child. It was a conscious, focused, pleading look. Lucas was asking for help, without words. And for the first time in 8 years, Robert truly saw his son. He approached the bed and said in a firm voice, "Gabriel, son, I need you to be honest with me. Are you really in pain?" Gabriel hesitated. He looked at Marshall, then at his father, then at Julia, and then in a trembling voice he said, "No, Dad, I'm not in pain. Dr. Marshall asked me to pretend." The silence that followed was absolute. Marshall stood frozen, his expression a mask of shock and anger. Robert closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to process what he had just heard. Julia felt tears stream down her face. Robert knelt beside his sons and held both their hands. "Why did you never tell me the truth?" It was Lucas who answered, his voice choked with emotion. "Because we were scared, Dad. Dr. Marshall said that if we told you we could see something, you would be very sad. You would think you spent all that money for nothing, that you were a bad father, and we didn't want to disappoint you. We love you." Robert hugged both boys tightly, sobbing. "You have never disappointed. Me, never. I'm the one who failed you. I'm the one who didn't see. Forgive me, please forgive me." Marshall started to back toward the door, but Robert quickly stood up and blocked his path. "You're not leaving here until the police arrive. You manipulated my children. You profited from their suffering. You stole years of happiness that they will never get back." Marshall tried to maintain his composure. "You have no proof of anything. These are just the words of confused children. Any lawyer would tear that apart in seconds." Robert smiled, but it was a bitter smile. "I have 8 years of financial records. I have records of every payment made to clinics and labs connected to you. I have the videos Julia recorded. I have the testimony of Dr. Helen Martin. And I have the word of my own sons. Do you really think that's not enough?" Marshall realized he was cornered. He tried one last gambit. "Robert, think carefully. Do you really want to expose your family to a public scandal? Do you want the whole world to know you were deceived for years, that your sons lived a lie? We can resolve this discreetly. I'll step away. You seek other professionals. And we all move on." Robert took a step forward, his eyes blazing with contained rage. "I don't care about a scandal. I care about justice, and you will pay for every single day you stole from my sons." Marshall tried to argue further, but Robert had already picked up the phone and called the police. While they waited, Julia sat on the bed next to the boys. Gabriel and Lucas snuggled up to her, finally allowing themselves to be just children. Scared, confused children, but for the first time in a long time, they felt that someone was truly protecting them. Marissa and the other household staff were called to the office. Robert questioned each of them about what they knew, what they had noticed over the years. Some cried, saying they had always suspected something was wrong, but were afraid of losing their jobs. Others swore they were just following Dr. Marshall's orders and had no idea of the extent of the fraud. Only Mr. Armstrong, the driver, had the courage to say what he really thought. "I always knew there was something rotten here, boss, but who was going to believe? Me. I'm just an employee. You trusted the doctor. Everyone trusted him. He was very good at making people believe him." When the police arrived, Marshall tried to maintain his dignity. He presented himself as the victim of a misunderstanding, claiming it was all just a misinterpretation of complex medical protocols. But the officers collected the documents, recorded the statements of Robert, Julia, and the boys themselves, and took Marshall to the station for questioning. He left the mansion in handcuffs, with the expression of someone who still couldn't believe his empire of lies had crumbled. In the following days, the story made headlines. The investigative press began to unravel the scheme. Journalists contacted other families who had been treated by Marshall over the years, and the revelations were devastating. There were at least 17 families trapped in the same fraudulent scheme. Children diagnosed with irreversible conditions when they actually had potential for recovery. £1 million treatments that lasted for years with no real results. Clinics and labs that raked in fortunes while keeping patients indefinitely dependent. Dr. Helen Martin was called to testify and presented all the documentation she had gathered over the years. Other professionals who had been silenced or dismissed for questioning Marshall also came forward. And slowly, the web of corruption was publicly exposed. Marshall Taylor was formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, forgery of medical documents, and criminal negligence. His medical license was revoked, his bank accounts were frozen, and he would await trial in custody. Robert hired a multidisciplinary team to re-evaluate Lucas and Gabriel, ophthalmologists, neurologists, occupational therapists. They all reached the same conclusion. The boys had significant functional vision. It wasn't perfect vision. There were limitations due to years without proper stimulation. But with therapy, visual exercises, and correct follow-up, they could develop a quality of life they had never imagined possible. The first time Lucas and Gabriel went out into the mansion's garden in the sunlight was a moment Julia would never forget. The boys stood still for long minutes, just feeling the warmth on their faces, the brightness in their eyes, the green of the trees around them. Then Gabriel pointed to a red flower and said, his voice full of emotion, "I'm seeing it, Dad. I'm really seeing it." Robert hugged his sons and cried, as he hadn't cried since he lost his wife. But these were different tears. They weren't tears of despair or guilt. They were tears of relief, of hope, of a new beginning. Julia watched the scene from a distance, her heart overflowing. She had risked everything to get to this point. She had faced threats, doubts, fear. But it was worth it. Every second of anxiety was worth it when she saw those boys finally free to be children. Robert approached her and held her hands gratefully. "Julia, I have no words to thank you for what you've done. You saved my sons. You saved my family." Julia smiled, tears in her eyes. "I just did what was right, what anyone should do. But it wasn't just anyone who did it, it was you. And I want you to know that from now on, you are part of this family, not as an employee, as someone who will always be by our side." In the following months, life at the mansion changed completely. The curtains were opened, light flooded every room. Lucas and Gabriel began to explore the world with a curiosity that had been suppressed for so long. They learned to run in the garden, to play with a ball, to recognize colors and shapes. Their laughter filled the house with a joy that had seemed impossible months ago. Robert created a foundation called Light and Truth, dedicated to investigating cases of medical fraud and offering free second opinions to vulnerable families. Dr. Helen Martin became the foundation's medical director, and Julia, publicly recognized as the woman who unmasked a multi-million-pound corruption scheme, was invited to give lectures, write articles, and become an advocate for the rights of children with disabilities. But despite all the attention and recognition, what mattered most to Julia were the small moments. Seeing Lucas trying to read his first words in large print. Seeing Gabriel drawing the sun with a yellow crayon. seeing the two brothers running together in the daylight, without fear, without chains, without lies. The battle had been won. The truth had prevailed. And two children who had lived for 8 years in darkness could finally see not only the world around them, but also the future that lay before them. 6 months later, London was experiencing a mild autumn. The trees in Belgravia were beginning to turn golden, and the afternoon light streamed through the windows of the Forrester mansion with a softness that had seemed impossible not long ago. The house that was once a mausoleum of gloom and silence now vibrated with life. Laughter echoed through the corridors, music played in the living room, and in the garden, 2 brown-haired boys chased a ball, tripping over their own feet, falling on the grass and getting up with wide smiles on their faces. Julia watched it all from the veranda, a cup of coffee in her hands, and her heart overflowing with gratitude. Not a day went by that she didn't remember how different everything could have been. How if she had accepted the silence and followed the rules without question, those boys would still be trapped in a darkness that was never real. But she had chosen the harder path. She had chosen courage. And now she saw the fruits of that choice blooming before her eyes. Lucas ran up to the veranda, his cheeks pink from exercise. "Julia, Julia, look what I can do." And then, with a childish pride that would melt any heart, he picked up a picture book and began to read aloud, pointing to each word with his little finger. The boy who was supposedly never going to see was reading, really reading. With difficulty, of course, with pauses and mistakes, but reading. Julia knelt and hugged Lucas tightly. "You're amazing, sweetheart. More amazing every day." Gabriel appeared shortly after, carrying a drawing he had made with crayons. It was a simple, almost abstract drawing, but filled with vibrant colors. A yellow sun in the top right corner, a house with open windows, 2 small figures that were clearly him and his brother, and next to them 3 larger figures. Julia recognized them immediately. It was their father, herself, and a female silhouette that Gabriel had drawn with special care. "Who is this one here, Gabriel?" Julia asked, touching the 3rd figure. Gabriel smiled shyly. "It's Mom. We never saw her, but Dad showed us pictures. She was beautiful, and now we can see her face in the photos. It's really cool." Julia felt a lump in her throat. Robert's wife, who had passed away when the boys were just babies, could now finally be seen by them. It was as if a lost piece of the family had been recovered, even if only through images. Robert appeared on the veranda at that moment, still in his business suit, having just arrived from an important meeting. He knelt beside his sons and looked at the drawing with restrained emotion. "She was beautiful, Gabriel, and she loved you both very much. If she were here now, she would be so proud of everything you've accomplished." The boys hugged their father, and the 3 of them stood there for a few minutes in a comfortable silence that needed no words. Julia discreetly stepped back, giving them space for their family moment. But Robert called her back. "Julia, you're part of this too. Come here." She joined the group hug and, for the first time since it all began, felt that she had truly made a difference. Not just in the lives of those 3 people, but in the world. That same afternoon, Robert and Julia had a meeting scheduled at the headquarters of the Light and Truth Foundation. The organization had grown exponentially in recent months. What had started as an initiative to investigate Marshall Taylor's case had transformed into a national movement to combat medical fraud and defend the rights of people with disabilities. The foundation had already received over 200 reports from families who suspected mistaken diagnoses or dubious treatments, and in at least 30 cases, they had managed to prove serious irregularities. Dr. Helen Martin was in the meeting room when Julia and Robert arrived. Next to her was a woman of about 40, her eyes red from crying, and an expression of relief and gratitude. Helen made the introductions. "Robert, Julia, this is Patricia Allen. She is the mother of Sophia, a 10-year-old girl who was also a patient of Dr. Marshall Taylor." Patricia stood up and shook both their hands firmly. "I don't know how to thank you. When I read about your case in the newspapers, I felt like I had finally found someone who understood. My daughter was diagnosed at age 3 with severe cerebral palsy. Marshall said she would never walk, never talk, never be independent. We spent everything we had on treatments he recommended, expensive therapies that never worked, and Sophia remained there, stuck in a wheelchair, treated as if she were incapable of everything. "And what happened?" Julia asked, already anticipating the answer. Patricia wiped away her tears. "When your foundation contacted us, we got a second evaluation with other specialists, and they discovered that Sophia does have a neurological condition, but it's completely different from what Marshall had diagnosed. With proper physical therapy, she can walk. She's already walking with support. And she talks. She talks a lot. She tells stories, sings songs, asks questions. She was trapped not because of the disease, but because of the wrong diagnosis, just like your sons were, Mr. Forrester." Robert hugged Patricia. "It's not your fault. It was never our fault. We trusted those who were supposed to protect us, and we were betrayed, but now we are fighting to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Helen picked up a folder from the table and opened it. "Of the 17 families we've identified as direct victims of Marshall Taylor's scheme, 14 have already secured re-evaluations and new therapies. 3 children who were supposedly never going to walk are now walking. 5 who were supposedly blind have functional vision. 2 who were diagnosed with severe mental retardation are attending mainstream school. It's incredible how the lives of these families have changed in a matter of months." Julia felt her chest swell with emotion. "And what about Marshall's trial?" Helen sighed. "The trial is set for 3 weeks from now. The prosecution has gathered enough evidence to secure a severe conviction. In addition to the 17 families who are direct victims, we've identified another 30 who also suffered from dubious diagnoses throughout his career. Some have already passed away. Others were so debilitated it will take years to reverse the damage, but they will all get justice." Robert clenched his fists. "He will pay for every life he ruined, for every family he destroyed, for every child he robbed." Patricia touched his arm gently. "He's already paying. He's lost everything. His reputation, his money, his freedom. But the most important thing is that the children now have a chance. That's what really matters." The following weeks were intense. The foundation received donations from business leaders, celebrities, and ordinary citizens who were moved by the story. With the money, they expanded their services, hired more professionals, and created an investigation protocol for suspicious cases. Julia was invited to give lectures at universities, hospitals, and public health events. She, who had always been just a caregiver, was now seen as a national hero. But every time someone called her that, she responded with humility. "I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should. Tadu, I questioned, I investigated, and I didn't give up when I was told to be quiet. Anyone can be brave when the situation demands it. You just have to choose to do the right thing." The day of the trial arrived on a cold June morning. The Old Bailey was packed. Journalists, cameras, victims' families, curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to see the outcome of the story that had shocked the nation. Julia was sitting next to Robert and the boys. Lucas and Gabriel were wearing new glasses, recommended by the ophthalmologists who were now treating them. They looked around, with childish curiosity, absorbing every detail of the new and strange environment. When Marshall Taylor entered the courtroom, handcuffed and escorted by police officers, a general murmur went through the crowd. The man who once exuded arrogance and authority now seemed smaller, older, defeated. His eyes met no one's. He knew there was no way out. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented documents, medical reports, victim testimonies, and financial evidence showing the flow of money between the families and the clinics linked to Marshall. The defense tried to argue that it was all just honest medical errors, different interpretations of complex exams. But the evidence was irrefutable. There was a clear pattern. Wealthy families were targeted. Vulnerable children were used as a source of continuous profit. And Marshall was the conductor of a criminal orchestra that had been playing for over 15 years. On the 3rd day, it was the victims' turn to give their testimonies. Patricia Allen spoke about Sophia, about the lost years, the money spent, and the hope she had finally found. Other mothers and fathers took the witness stand and told similar stories, stories of children who lived less than they could have, of families who went into ruinous debt, of dreams destroyed by greed. When it was Robert's turn, he walked to the microphone with firm steps. His voice was choked, but it was strong. I trusted this man with what was most precious to me, my sons. He promised me he would do everything in his power to care for them, and I believed him. I spent millions. I invested years. I followed every protocol, every instruction, every rule, and all the while, my sons were living in a prison of darkness that never needed to exist. They could have run in the garden at age 3. They could have seen their own mother's face in photos. They could have gone to school, made friends, lived, but they didn't. They were robbed of 8 years of childhood. And that is something no sentence, no prison, no conviction will ever give back. I only hope this trial prevents other families from going through the same thing. When Robert returned to his seat, Lucas and Gabriel hugged him. Julia held his hand, offering the silent support he so desperately needed at that moment. Then it was Julia's turn to take the witness stand. She looked at Marshall, who finally raised his eyes and met hers. There was hatred in that look, but there was also defeat. Julia took a deep breath and began to speak. I entered that house as an ordinary employee. I had no intention of being a hero or changing the world. I just wanted to work, pay my bills, and start over after losing my previous job. But when I saw those children, when I realized something was wrong, I couldn't pretend I didn't see it. I couldn't follow the rules and ignore my conscience, and I was lucky. I had the courage to question, and I found people who supported me. But how many other people questioned and were silenced? How many other professionals had suspicions and were threatened? This man did not act alone. He had power, influence, money. He knew how to manipulate, how to threaten, how to control. And he did it for years. It wasn't a medical error. It was a choice, a conscious choice to profit from the suffering of innocent children. And for that, he must pay. At the end of the 3rd day, the judge retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. 2 hours that felt like an eternity. When the judge returned, everyone stood. The sentence was read aloud, clear and firm. Marshall Taylor, you have been found guilty on 17 counts of medical fraud, forgery of documents, aggravated embezzlement, and criminal negligence. The sentence is 25 years of imprisonment in a maximum security facility, with no possibility of parole before serving half the sentence. Furthermore, you are banned from practicing medicine in any capacity for the rest of your life. Your assets will be seized and used for compensation for the victim families. May this sentence serve as an example to all those who would think of using medicine as a tool for exploitation and greed. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears. Marshall lowered his head and was led away by the officers. There was no final word, no remorse, just silence. Outside the courthouse, journalists surrounded Julia, Robert, and the other families. Cameras recorded everything. Questions came from all sides. How do you feel? Does this change anything? What would you say to other people who suspect wrong diagnoses? Julia looked directly into the cameras and said firmly, I would tell them to trust their instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Question it. Seek second opinions. Don't be afraid to challenge authorities. And above all, fight for your children. Fight with everything you have, because they deserve it. The following months brought changes that went beyond the trial. The story of Lucas and Gabriel inspired legislative changes. A bill was passed requiring all diagnoses of severe and irreversible conditions in children to be validated by at least 3 independent specialists with no financial ties to one another. Furthermore, a national fund was created to provide free second opinions to low-income families. The Light and Truth Foundation became an international benchmark. It received invitations from other countries to share its methodology for investigating and protecting vulnerable patients. And Julia, who had started as a caregiver, was now the foundation's executive director, managing a team of over 50 professionals dedicated to protecting children and families. But despite all her professional success, what truly mattered to Julia were the small moments. Like that September afternoon, almost a year after it all began, when Lucas and Gabriel celebrated their 9th birthday. The party was simple, held in the mansion's garden. There were colorful balloons, chocolate cake, games, and lots of laughter. Friends from the school the boys had recently made were there. Children running, jumping, shouting. Everything a child's party should be. During a pause, as everyone sang Happy Birthday, Julia watched Lucas and Gabriel blow out the candles with their eyes closed, making their secret wishes. And when they opened their eyes again, they looked directly at her and smiled. They were no longer the quiet, motionless, frightened children she had met a year ago. They were lively, curious, happy boys. Robert approached Julia and said softly, "Thank you for everything." Julia smiled. "You don't have to thank me anymore, Robert. This is the thanks. Seeing them like this, seeing this party, seeing life where there was only darkness." Robert looked at his sons, then at Julia. "You saved my family, and now you're saving others. You're extraordinary." Julia shook her head. "I'm ordinary. I'm just someone who chose not to stay silent. Anyone can do that. And that's what I hope. That more and more people find the courage to question, to fight, to not accept injustice." Later, as the party was winding down and the guests were beginning to leave, Gabriel pulled Julia to a quiet corner of the garden. He was holding something in his hands. It was a colorful envelope. "Julia, I made this for you." She opened the envelope and found a drawing. It was much more elaborate than the first one Gabriel had made months ago. It showed the mansion's garden full of colorful flowers. In the center, 3 figures, Robert, Lucas, and Gabriel, and next to them a 4th figure, Julia. But what caught her attention most were the words written in large, uneven letters at the bottom of the drawing. "Thank you for teaching us to see," Julia hugged Gabriel and cried. They were tears of pure happiness, tears of fulfillment, tears of someone who knew she had fulfilled her purpose. Lucas joined the hug. "We love you, Julia. I love you too. Very much." That night, when everyone had gone home and the mansion had returned to tranquility, Julia stood alone on the veranda, watching the stars. She thought about how everything had changed in just 1 year. She thought about the lives that were saved, the families that were reunited, the children who could finally live. She thought about how a single decision can change everything. The decision not to remain silent, the decision to question, the decision to fight. And she thought that deep down, we all have that power. The power to make a difference, the power to choose courage over fear, the power to light a candle where there is only darkness. Lucas and Gabriel would never again live in the shadows. They would never again be prisoners of a false diagnosis. They would never again be victims of greed and manipulation. Now they had a future. They had dreams. They had light. And it all started because an ordinary woman on an ordinary day decided she would not accept the lie. Life went on. The boys grew up. Robert rebuilt not only his family but his faith in humanity. The Light and Truth Foundation continued to save lives, one at a time. And Julia, the caregiver who became a hero, never stopped being that person who believes that every child deserves a chance. Every family deserves the truth. And every injustice deserves to be confronted. Because in the end, that's what makes us human. Not our ability to see with our eyes, but our ability to see with our hearts, to see what is wrong and choose to do something about it. To hear the silent cry of those who suffer and decide not to ignore it. And so, after 8 years of imposed darkness, after months of struggle and courage, after tears and victories, the truth finally prevailed. The light overcame the shadows, and 2 children who should have lived forever, trapped now, ran free under the sun, seeing the world with eyes that should never have been forced to remain closed. Lucas and Gabriel were no longer victims. They were survivors. They were examples. They were living proof that no lie, no matter how well constructed, is stronger than the truth, and that no darkness, no matter how deep it seems, can resist the light of someone who refuses to give up. High up in the mansion, at night, the lights now shone brightly. There were no more closed curtains, no more gloom, no more secrets, just a family that finally allowed itself to live. And a woman who proved that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing what is right, even when fear insists it's not worth it. And it was worth it. Every second was worth it. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Lucas, Gabriel, Robert, and Julia has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by the courage of this ordinary woman who refused to stay silent, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you most in this journey for the truth. Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and remind us that each of us has the power to make a difference. May this story inspire you to never ignore your conscience and to always fight for what is right. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, with more emotion, more truth, and more stories that deserve to be told.